You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have some breaking news here that signals a major rebuke against Donald Trump in his effort to fight against his political opponents. Can you explain what just happened in court?
Yeah, Brian, the criminal cases against both James Comey and Letitia James have been dismissed by the federal judge who had to rule on whether Lindsay Halligan's appointment as interim U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia was lawful and unlawful. I'm going to say, not surprisingly, Judge Curry ruled it was unlawful, illegal. There was no way to save it. Now, Brian, the reason I don't think that is all that earth-shattering is because we've seen this movie before. Remember Elena Haba up in New Jersey? Donald Trump tried to appoint her as interim U.S. attorney in violation of the same federal statute, and a federal judge previously ruled that her appointment was illegal. We can move out to the West Coast, the Central District of California, where Trump tried to do the same thing with a guy named Bill Eseli, and a federal judge out there ruled that that appointment as interim U.S. attorney was unlawful. And here we go again. This is the highest stakes litigation of this issue imaginable, because with the ruling that Lindsay Halligan was unlawfully appointed as interim U.S. attorney, she had absolutely no right and no legal authority to set a single foot in that grand jury room and urge a grand jury to criminally indict James Comey, the former FBI director, or to criminally indict Letitia James, the current New York State Attorney General. This is an enormous blow to Donald Trump, to Pam Bondi and the leadership at the Department of Justice, to Lindsay Halligan. But I'll tell you, it is an enormous win for the rule of law and for the Constitution, and needless to say, for James Comey and Letitia James.
How does this impact Trump's ability to continue on with these political prosecutions?
Great question. So it may impact the different cases differently. Because this indictment of James Comey came literally days before, it would have timed out. It would have expired courtesy of what's called the statute of limitations, which says you got 5 years from the date of the alleged crime, which was lying to Congress, is what Donald Trump and Pam Bondi claimed. It doesn't look like the evidence bears it out. But let's assume James Comey lied to Congress. Within just a couple of days of that 5-year deadline expiring, the now we know unlawfully appointed U.S. Attorney Lindsay Halligan ran into the grand jury and got an indictment. But guess what? Now that it has been ruled unlawful and the indictment has been thrown out, it doesn't look like they're going to be able to try again because the statute of limitations has long since expired. And there is a suggestion in Judge Curry's ruling that that is the case. Now, let me just add a footnote. There is what's called a saving provision. There's a federal law that says, well, if the case is dismissed for any reason beyond the statute of limitations, the prosecutors, the Department of Justice, gets another 6 months to try to clean it up and bring it again. It doesn't look like that statute will apply here for reasons that I'm not going to try to, do a deep dive into. And I'm going to take Judge Curry at her word in her ruling that says, nope, looks like James Comey's may have timed out. So bye-bye permanently to a prosecution of James Comey. Little bit different circumstance with Letitia James. Her case is not bumping up against the deadline, the statute of limitations. So it looks like they will probably be able to get a, lawfully appointed prosecutor, maybe an acting U.S. attorney, which is different from an interim U.S. attorney, and go back into the grand jury and try again to indict Letitia James. But that's only the beginning of the Letitia James saga, because there are still multiple motions to dismiss in the Letitia James case: vindictive prosecution, selective prosecution, abuse of the grand jury in other ways. So, it looks like this may be a permanent win for James Comey, but a temporary win ultimately for Letitia James.
And that's what I wanted to dig into here. This is only regarding the fact that Lindsay Halligan was improperly appointed to her position. They didn't even get the opportunity to dismiss this thing yet because it's a political prosecution, a selective prosecution. And so even if Lindsay Halligan was properly appointed, doesn't it still lend itself to reason that if this case did go forward, that it probably wouldn't have lasted much longer because of how blatantly politicized all of this is?
Exactly right, Brian. And one of the complicating factors for James Comey, you just heard me say a moment ago that this case is permanently over, it looks like, for him. Let's assume it goes up to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals said, no, we agree. But it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And, we know how the Supreme Court tends to lean these days. If Donald Trump wants something, he's often going to get it. Express terms of the Constitution be damned. And so maybe they revive it. But, then it would go all the way back down to the trial court. And guess what? We are now in full-blown motions hearings in the Comey case on vindictive prosecution, selective prosecution, abuse of the grand jury. So, I think this is a really good day for James Comey, and it signals that case, even if it comes back again, which I would like to think is unlikely, he will still have many more bites at the dismissal apple.
Now, Glenn, the obvious question here that we always have to ask is, what are Trump's appeal options? I know that you had said that they were limited in terms of what the statute of limitations allows, but it's unlike Donald Trump to just kind of take no for an answer. And so what can he do in terms of appealing this thing or continuing to try and get bites of the apple, despite the fact that Judge Curry has said that Lindsey Halligan was improperly appointed?
Well, the statute of limitations piece for the Comey case is not really going to come into play directly when it comes to the decision whether Trump's DOJ will want to appeal these two dismissals. I suspect they will appeal both, and they will hope that eventually it will make its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will find something to dislike about Judge Curry's ruling, or maybe about the statutory scheme that gets to the ruling in the first place. This is a really deep dive. But the statutory scheme says after 120 days, if Congress hasn't confirmed somebody to the position of U.S. attorney that Donald Trump or a president has nominated, well, then the judges of the district court in which the U.S. attorney's office resides, does business, those judges get to make an appointment. I could see the Supreme Court saying, wait a minute. That smells to us like an interference in presidential power. And we know how those arguments tend to go when Donald Trump makes his way to the Supreme Court and there is a suggestion that, God forbid, Congress gets involved in anything that they think might trample on the prerogatives of a president. I hate to even raise that when we are in the celebrating mode because the rule of law has asserted itself in full force today. But, with this Supreme Court, we always have to kind of keep one eye out for what those 6 right-wing Supreme Court justices might do.
Glenn, given the time crunch that the administration was operating under here to try and get this thing in under the wire before the statute of limitations ran out, why do you think they would put their eggs in the Lindsey Halligan basket, recognizing that she wasn't even properly appointed, so that in and of itself puts the entire case at risk?
Because they were desperate. Remember, the interim U.S. attorney at the time, somebody Donald Trump had appointed, Eric Siebert, had reached the conclusion, no, we don't have the goods on James Comey, and I will not indict him. And they were desperate. They literally had like 2 or 3 days. So Donald Trump grabbed former insurance lawyer Lindsey Halligan out of the White House and just threw her into the position and then into the grand jury. They were desperate, and they probably couldn't find any legitimate attorney who would go in, somebody who cared about the ethics of our practice, somebody who cared about their license to practice law, and actually go in and indict the unindictable. So they were left with hack and flunky Lindsey Halligan.
The interesting part of this, and you and I have spoken about this before, is this idea that we were on opposite ends of the question of whether or not it's a good thing for these DOJ prosecutors, FBI agents, whoever it may be, that were resigning in the beginning of the year to do so. And my contention was, if these people leave and virtuous though it may be to do so, to stand up and vocally resign, that all that's going to do is create a vacuum that's going to be filled with people who are perfectly content to kowtow to this administration, to be loyal to Donald Trump, not the Constitution, but the president. And I think that we're seeing your position vindicated here because, those people did resign. Yes, they were filled with people who were loyal to this administration, but that didn't fix the problem of, okay, but they still have to be effective in a courtroom.
Yeah.
When you've got somebody like Lindsay Halligan who is kind of showing her ass in the worst way, on a daily basis, whenever she does end up in a courtroom, that puts on full display the fact that it's not just about having prosecutors who are loyal to the president. It's about having prosecutors who know what the fuck they're doing. And we've seen numerous instances where these Trump administration officials or these prosecutors whose, sole qualification to be there was that they could, kiss the ring of dear leader, that's not exactly translating into effective prosecutions in the courtroom. And so I think that this Lindsay Halligan case is the latest and probably most egregious example of exactly that.
Yeah, and Eric Siebert ends up kind of looking like the hero here because, one, he didn't obey in advance because he was not willing to do something that was unethical. Two, he didn't resign at the earliest opportunity when Trump took office. Instead, he tried to do the hard work of the American people until he was put in a position when his ethics said no. And by his ethics saying no, Brian, we learned that a Trump-appointed interim U.S. Attorney, Eric Siebert, said, no, this case should not be indicted. We learned about that, which acted as a nice springboard for us to then be 3/4 of the way home, in reaching the conclusion that Lindsay Halligan did the dirty bidding of the Trump administration. And now we know she did it unlawfully. So DOJ, Lindsay Halligan, Pam Bondi, and Donald Trump all lose.
And finally, Glenn, last question here. What is next on the chopping block in terms of these political prosecutions that you're keeping an eye on, given the fact that we've had this ruling as it relates to James Comey and Letitia James?
Well, we will watch to see the litigation in these cases as it moves forward through the appellate courts. Of course, we just had the John Bolton, which was kind of the third in the potentially vindictive prosecution hat trick that Donald Trump's DOJ pulled. But I separate that case out because it looks like on the evidence, it's a very different case from the James Comey and Letitia James cases. In part, that case was indicted by career federal prosecutors, some of 10, 12, and 15 years at the Maryland U.S. Attorney's Office, and it looks like they may actually have the goods on Bolton. It doesn't mean it wasn't inspired by Donald Trump's insatiable appetite for revenge, but that alone may not make it a winning vindictive prosecution defense, but we're keeping our eye on that case as well.
And of course, we will cover those as soon as we have any updates. So for those who are watching, if you'd like to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. I'm going to put the links to both of our channels right here on the screen. If you're not yet subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. It's completely free and always will be. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.